I'm going to preface this by saying that I have a sore throat right now, a pretty bad one. I just took a swig of, the throat syrup, and I've got Sucrets lying here if I need them, but if I'm having issues, that's why. Resident Evil 4 is one of those games that if you asked me, do you like it? I'd say, yeah. And then I reviewed it. Dramatic pause. No, it's actually a good game. And I can't tell you how much of a relief that is, to be completely honest. Because there have been a lot of games that I remember enjoying for various reasons. As we talked about with, for example, Mega Man 7, or Mega Man X4, or Mega Man X3. All of those were relatively recently. And all of those were games I enjoyed at the time for my own reasons. But they weren't really all that good of games. So it's always nice to remember a game fondly and then go through and play it. And hey, guess what? It's actually a good game. It has a couple of niggles, I'm not going to lie. It makes sense, though. So let's talk through this shall we? Now, the full in-depth behind-the-scenes in Resident Evil 4 would be a video by itself. And no offense, but I not only don't have time for that, but throat. So the good news is I've already covered most of that. No, really. Because if you remember, I talked about the overhaul upheaval that Capcom was going through the Mega Man X series of videos and streams as we were discussing that. Because there was a large period of them just doing a massive restructure and how much of an impact that had on every project they were working on, which was quite a few. So that's cool. And as a result, they started working on Resident Evil 3. Quite earlier than this, a lot earlier than this. And that didn't pan out, so they started working on Resident Evil 3, and then that kind of turned into Nemesis, but then they started working on Resident Evil 3 for real, but that turned into Code Veronica, and then they started working on a Resident Evil 4, but that turned into something else, and then they had Resident Evil 4, but that turned into Devil May Cry, and then they had Resident Evil 4, and I'm not even exaggerating. By my count, they released 5 separate versions of Resident Evil 4 before this one. And part of it's because it kept getting bounced around, part of it's because they kept changing their minds, and part of it's because gaming kept shifting. This makes sense. This was the late 90s and early aughts, and anybody who remembers that era remembers that was a hell of an overhaul period for gaming in general. Think about the fact that we went from the SNES to the PS2 in that era, and you can see why I say that. So, Resident Evil 4 came out on the GameCube. It'll never come out on the PS2. Came out on the PS2 a couple months later. I believe this is also the second most ported game ever. I'm not actually 100% sure about that. Obviously, Doom beats it out of the water because Doom will always be the most ported. But everyone always memes about how many versions of Skyrim we get. And obviously, there are quite a few versions of Skyrim. But Resident Evil 4 has that completely blasted, which is funny because we've never really had a remaster and certainly not a remake of 4. I'm stating this to date myself because I'll be curious if the rumors that have been circling for over 2 years now about a remake done in the style of Resident Evil 2's remake or Resident Evil 3's remake will be done for 4. I was actually just waiting for news to drop while we were streaming it because that's just how that works, right? A lot of mess, a lot of weirdness, a lot of nonsense. But it's okay because they completely changed the series direction and made it a full action game, right? Wrong. Now, hang on. Don't attack me with pitchforks. Let me explain. One of the things I never really fully cognated through this until this playthrough, because I played this game like 4 or so times before. I think it's 4. I'm pretty sure it's 4. It has New Game Plus. What do you want from me? Was the fact that it's not actually an action game. It is a Resident Evil game with the skin of an action game. And you might think, well, but think about all the big action-y sequences. Yeah, but that's flavor, tone, atmosphere kind of a thing. The game side of things is still very much a Resident Evil game. For good and for bad. Because, I mean, it's easy to see the bones if you actually sit down and play it and think about it. But the most obvious example I could give is really simple. When the Ganagos start attacking you, they do this. They don't bite you. I know that's a minor thing to point out, and I know it's just animation reuse, but I'm mentioning it to get across the point. They are, in virtually every way, designed to be zombies. Varying types of zombies, zombies that use weapons, zombies that have different AI scripts, but still zombies. And the way you move, the way you interact with stuff, the way, the limited inventory, and the item management, and the resources management, and trying to push your way through, and balancing combat versus exploration and all that, it's a Resident Evil game. Now, hang on. There is one thing it does substantially different, and that's its approach to itemization. This is where the game really starts to branch, I think, and in my opinion, for the better. Hear me out for a second. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, like I said, throat. Oh, yeah. I'm going to enjoy going to bed tonight, I'll tell you what. Itemization is what I usually refer to as how a game gets what to you and when. In a first-person shooter, it's do the enemies drop items and where are the items in the level. In a Mega Man game or a platformer, it's, again, drops and how things are placed. And same general concept with the Resident Evil game. This also applies to RPGs with regards to what equipment is where or what enemies drop which kind of loot. Itemization is in almost every type of game. Not every type, but almost every type. So, itemization in a Resident Evil game is extremely critical because it's all about resource management. So much of the Resident Evil core gameplay is about, okay, I've got 8 more bullets of this and 6 more bullets of this, and I got 1 green herb on me. Okay, I just need to make it to here. I think I could do that, and I need to choose my battles, right? Because you can't just kill everything unless you're good enough. Of course, you can do it. Because let's be honest, there's knife-only playthroughs. Of course, you can do it, but what's supposed to be going through your mind is, should I, or can I do it? For example, so that's definitely here and in spades, but they do it differently. So the items that drop are relative to what you use, what you have in your inventory, and what you are lacking. It's not 100%. It's not like, say, Super Metroid, where you can pretty much predict with 90% certainty what an enemy is going to drop. And it's not like a Zelda game where you can predict with 100% certainty what an enemy is going to drop. This is more like it's an inclination, higher chance to get certain types of things. So you at least have a chance of getting something if you're low on it, or getting, for example, handgun bullets if you happen to be using primarily handgun, like if that's what you've got in your inventory. So that's cool, and that's useful, and that's awesome. But it's still a chance. It's still a risk. How many of you have ever sat down in your head when you're playing this game? It's a terrible way to phrase that sentence. How many of you have ever, while playing this game, had a pause moment and think, should I risk the bullets on killing those things in the hopes that they drop something worthwhile? Now, hang on, it gets even better than this. Because in addition to this dynamic system and the manual stuff they've put in the world, there's the treasure. Now, the treasure is interesting. So let's rewind a second. The 2 main resources we have is our health and our ammunition. Ammunition can only come from drops, either in the world or on enemies. Health can only come in drops in the world or from enemies. Okay? That's it. Then there's treasure. Now, yes, I know you can buy first aid sprays, but those are an incredibly rare, limited resource that aren't always available. So, for all intents and purposes, you cannot purchase health or ammo. What can you purchase? Upgrades and equipment. You can increase your inventory size, you can get different guns, you can get better guns, and you can get maps and armor upgrade and a few other things, right? You can upgrade your character. And I didn't realize this either until this playthrough. Treasure is the equivalent, functionally, of experience in a typical RPG. You level up in this game via treasure. Now that's cool in its own right, but what's really cool is how it works, because treasure is extremely optional. You will probably need, and you will probably get, ammo and health, because it's littered throughout the world, even if you kill nothing in an entire playthrough, which I don't even think is actually possible, because I don't think you can actually do a pacifist playthrough. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here. I think there's certain times where you have to kill to progress, like the cabin, if nothing else, right? Anyways, point being that you have to get those things to some extent or another, but you don't have to get any treasure. You can go through the whole game with 0 pesetas in the entire run, and that's it. We're done. We're cool. But you can get treasure. In fact, treasure is probably the single most common drop-off of enemies. Not a lot of it, usually only a few hundred or maybe 1,000 per enemy, which isn't a huge amount, but it adds up over time. And then there's the fact that enemies can drop the actual treasure items, which you can sell. And then there's the fact that you can find them while you're exploring, most of which are manually stated. That's cool enough in its own right, but you realize you're probably already seeing how this kind of fits the other 2 systems. So we've got limited resources, but hang on, if I go around that corner, I know I don't need to, but if I do, I might find another spinel. And that's another few thousand pesetas, and I could use that to try and get an upgrade on my handgun. risk-reward is an equation that is essentially constantly going through your head, whether you're doing it consciously or otherwise, unless you're extremely familiar with the game or really good at the game or both. So you're thinking, okay, is that worth going over there? Is that worth doing that? Is that worth fighting those enemies? Is that worth trying to dodge through those enemies? Because if you try to dodge through, you're effectively risking your health. And if you try to fight through, you are risking your ammo. One way or another, your resource pools all tie into each other in how you're using them. Hang on, it gets even better. I like this game, by the way, if it's not obvious. Because of the fact that treasure has a little niggle to it. Now, this is tutorialized very early on. There's a little necklace, there's a pit of yuck, and there's a plank. You shoot the plank, thing goes down, you shoot the necklace, it drops down, you now have a pristine necklace, which is worth more. What did that cost you? 2 bullets. Even something as simple as that costs one of your resources to get. You spend ammunition in order to gain treasure. And there's a lot like that, where you shoot them down from like the ceiling or a statue or whatever, right? But that also tutorializes the idea that treasure doesn't have a static worth. This really comes in, I forget which thing is first. I think it's the lantern. No, I think there's something before the lantern. But the point is, you can combine certain treasures into something substantially more worthwhile. This changes the dynamic of the risk-reward, because you are now even more encouraged to really be thorough as you're exploring and try to make sure that you're getting absolutely every little thing that you can, because you want to make sure that you aren't missing a piece for that stein you're slowly putting together, because it's going to be worth a ton of money when you're done, and that's going to get you so many upgrades for your guns, or upgrade for your inventory size, or other stuff that is worthwhile. Your level will go up as a result. So now you're leaning even more towards trying to risk things in order to get those rewards. And the rewards are worthwhile, so it's not exactly a waste, except when it is, because obviously there's not that many treasures around, not the really worthwhile ones. But you get the idea, right? And so this whole system, these 4, actually, interlocking systems, all work beautifully together. And they all encourage the player to constantly keep moving forwards in an unending cycle of trying to do just good enough to progress. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to this, little niggles, which don't really make this work out. And I'm sure everyone in the comment section is pointing them out. I'm not going to go down the list. Obviously, there's the rocket launcher. There are cases where this isn't perfectly designed, but it is still very well designed for what it's trying to be. Which leads me, I suppose, is a good time to talk about how I absolutely despise the controls of this game. Before you jump down my throat, I should probably mention that I was playing the semi-recent, it came out like 5 years ago, PC port for this game. And so the controls obviously kind of suck in their own way. Trust me, they suck so much more on the PC version. The game does not know how to handle a mouse. I can't even explain it. If you saw the stream, you know what I'm talking about. The mouse doesn't interact well with the camera. There are times when the camera would just kind of go, because it's like, oh, right, I forgot the mouse existed. Oh, right, I remember the mouse existed just instantly. Because it doesn't know how to handle it at all. It is not programmed for it. And it's clear they're just kind of gluing the code for the camera onto the existing camera control. Aiming is terrible. Ignoring the fact that you're constantly shaking while aiming, you don't actually aim smoothly. It's not analog aiming. It's a grid. The most obvious way to see this, and again, I refer to the VOD on the stream for this, is when you're fighting a Dilaga or whatever, the big salamander fish thing in the lake, right? And you get the harpoon and you're aiming at it, and you aim here and you just barely tap it to the left and it shifts a whole grid to the left because you're aiming at a grid. That's how the game is programmed. And so that sucks. And it's kind of interesting when you're trying to be accurate to a great deal of range. You're not supposed to be able to do that. You can. You're supposed to have things like snipers and, the scopes in order to be able to pull that off. I was able to pull it off a few times with just my pistol because I could, but you get the point, right? But the worst thing of all was the fact that there was a legitimate straight up bug with the meleeing. You know the melee, right? You stun them with like a shot or whatever, and then you go, whoop, wah, and you knock them back. And it's an absolutely critical tool to help conserve ammunition. The aforementioned 3 resources. Thing is, it never worked. Or more accurately, never worked properly. Not a single time, not once, the entire game, did I do a melee attack on purpose. It would occasionally trigger, and I couldn't tell you why. Every time I tried to do it, it wouldn't happen. There were other issues, like the menu doesn't know how to deal with certain things, and there's other little things. It's not a great port, is what I'm trying to say. So that kind of dragged the game down. But not nearly as much as the DLC, if you can call it that. I guess this was kind of when we were still defining that term, wasn't it? So we have Mercenaries Mode. Let's go ahead and get this out of the way. Mercenaries Mode is awesome. It was actually a lot of fun. But let's explain why it's so much fun. You got about 2 minutes. Obviously, you can get more time. It's a horde mode. And you've got an arena, and it uses 4 separate arenas, each one of which is one of the better designed arenas in the game. There's lots of items you can pick up, lots of nodes for the enemies to spawn from, lots of terrain interactions you can use to help yourself with regards to maneuvering or shooting or killing or avoiding or whatever. Good stuff. The short timer also helps substantially, because even though this is primarily just a sit there and live combat thing, and it does kind of show off the combat of this game quite exceptionally, the short loop means if you screw up or you have issues or whatever, it's been 2 minutes. By contrast, if you do Ada's mission, which I can't even remember the name of, not the desperate one, the other one, or sorry, separate. Not desperate, separate ways. But Ada's mission, that takes forever. It can even take longer, and it's got all of the problems that comes with. It actually legitimately got boring after a certain point because it was just going through one of the levels without any of the interesting level design or encounter design or itemization or any of the cool stuff I just talked about that makes the game interesting. And instead it's just, here's what you got. Here's your area. Go find these things and then leave. Okay. And that took forever and was boring. By contrast, none of those problems were present in Mercenaries Mode, right? So that's cool. But then we have Ada's side mission, Separate Ways. I was expecting to really like this one. And then the game played about, I know this is an exaggeration, but it felt like a 2-second loop on the music. It's just a drum beat over and over and over and over and over for minutes. It's insanity. And it got really, really, really old. And I was like, oh God, I'm not going to like this one, aren't I? And sure enough, I didn't. The simplest way to explain this one is very easy. So, let's rewind time a little bit. Remember all those 4 mechanics, those 4 mechanisms and systems I talked about and how beautifully they complement each other? All 4 of those systems are trash if the level design doesn't support them. What enemies are, so it's even more than enemies. So you need to do enemy design. You need to make sure the enemies are interesting. You need to make sure that their health and their weak points and their attack patterns and how they move and everything, all of that has to be well designed. And that has to be designed in a way that complements the systems. And it has to be designed in a way that complements the combat while complementing the areas you fight them in. Now, all of this is stuff I've talked about constantly, usually in platformers, because this comes up a lot in platformers. But it's extremely important for a game like this for the exact same reason. A bad enemy in a good level, or a good enemy in a bad level, is a bad time, right? You need to have good enemy design, good mechanisms design, good combat design, good level design. You need to place things manually, think about what's going to be where, think about those spawn points, think about what they can launch, think about what they can drop, think about how they can attack you, think about how aggressive they're going to be. All of that stuff has to be designed. Some of you may remember I did a rumination on Resident Evil 3 Remake, and my biggest complaint with that game, by far, was that it didn't feel designed. There was no thought put into all of those things, no thought put into what connected with why, where, and what. It just felt thrown at the wall. It felt rushed together. It's like, okay, here's the level, and here's some enemies, have fun. And none of that felt designed. 4, by contrast, is brilliantly designed. There are exceptions. There are certain sequences which are not as well designed. I'm sure you can think of a few, but there's a few in the castle that come to mind immediately. Anyways, but care, thought, craft, design is clearly on display in all of these. Okay, so we've got a large open area. We don't want the player to get overwhelmed. Let's put some pools in the middle of the area so the player can have a path to kind of get the enemy caught on the terrain so that they can get a breather. They can kind of retreat a little bit if they need to. Good idea. Why don't we go ahead and add a couple, not a lot, but a couple of ranged enemies there too. So even as they're retreating, they have to deal with that or prioritize taking them down. Okay, good idea. Why don't we add a thing where we have a mechanic where anywhere from 1 to 5 of these enemies within this particular encounter can spawn the head things? Good idea. Why don't we make this the encounter where the head type B starts showing up so that the enemy knows, the player knows that they're there and can start dealing with them. You get my point. I could just go down the list. Resident Evil 4 has huge amounts of manual craft and care to its encounter design, level design, enemy design, itemization. None of that is in Separate Ways. It just feels like they copy-pasted the terrain for the level, blocked off the doors they don't want you to go through, and then shot some enemies into them and said, here you go. Nowhere is this more apparent, spoilers, than the Krauser fight, or the Krauser refight. Now, I should mention that the Krauser fight in Resident Evil 4 is my favorite boss in the entire game. No, really, it's awesome. It feels very much like the Metal Gear Solid 3 fight in all the right ways. You're given a huge arena, multiple areas, multiple avenues, items all over the place. You have multiple obstacles in your path, like little drone things, and you have to kind of maneuver your way through. There's the mines, of course. He'll be attacking you periodically, but you can prevent him from attacking you if you do enough damage to him in order to make him back off for a bit. You have to do a little puzzle and thing. It's just this wonderful, huge thing. Then you actually fight him. The knife does tons and tons of damage to him, like 60 damage a swing, which is, for those of you not aware, is absolutely insane amount of damage for this game. And he has a whole thing where you're encouraged to try and weaken him in order to really do damage to him, while at the same time dodging his attacks. It's possible to not even get hit on his fight. It's a very well designed fight. Now imagine, take all of that and throw all of it in the trash. And instead what you have is him doing his very basic, I'm going to have my arm lunge attack thing. I'm going to do the double backflip. I'm going to fight you in a very tiny 4x4 square, where there's nothing, no terrain, no design, no nothing. It's just the same damn combat encounter with the very final phase of him, with nothing else to complement it. And then do that 3 times in a row for no reason. Yeah, not super fun. At least the narrative of Separate Ways was okay, which I suppose is as good a time as any to shift into talking about story. Usual spoiler warnings. Spoilers, 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 spoilers. Let me tell you a bit of a story, if you don't mind. I know I shared this on stream, so forgive me for the repeat. Once upon a time, I played Resident Evil 1, the original version, and hated it, and kind of put it down and walked away from it. A few years later, I was visiting my cousin, actually, and he happened to own Resident Evil 2. I played a bit of it at his house. It was okay. I wasn't super into it. He also had Resident Evil 3, Nemesis, to be very clear about this. And that was okay, I guess. I don't know. Didn't catch me, though. Fast forward a while, and all of a sudden, I'm living with my roommate. This was during the Arby's job, for a bit of context here. And my friend happened to be, my roommate, I shouldn't call him my friend, happened to be really into Resident Evil and Batman, and equate that if you want. And he introduced me to Resident Evil 4. He had the GameCube copy, obviously. This was pretty much right when it came out. He was super jazzed. I ended up watching it, and I was like, this looks fun. So when he had played it to fruition, I asked him if I could borrow it, since I actually had a GameCube at that point in time. And I played through it 4 times in a row. My point is, this is the first time I really got into the Resident Evil series. I should probably mention that my 2 favorite Resident Evil games are 4 and 2 Remake, which probably ousts me as not a Resident Evil fan, but that's okay. I'm okay with that, because I like those games, and those games are awesome. But the reason I'm bringing this up isn't to kind of bash the games or the franchise or oust myself as a terrible person, but rather to explain something. I didn't really know jack about the Resident Evil series of any note until I played 4. And 4 kept dropping little hints. There's this organization, and at one point they mentioned Umbrella, and I'm like, well, wait, but Umbrella's already shut down. And several times they mentioned some character named Wesker, who I didn't even remember who that was. But the way he is portrayed in this game was a very teasing manner, a very I'm the villain behind the mask kind of a thing. Keep in mind, I didn't play Separate Ways back in the day, so I didn't even see him on camera. And my attention was piqued. I got into the lore of Resident Evil because of 4, because of the way it handled it. And I wanted to comment on that first, because this does something really rare in fiction. Usually fiction has one of 2 things when it comes to any kind of franchise that has a long-standing arc kind of a thing. There's usually 2 approaches. There's a Gaiden work, which has nothing to do with anything, or you're part of the arc. Rarely do I see something approach it and try to do both. This is a Gaiden story. This is a very small-scale story. It occurs over a single night,
and it happens in some backwater village in the middle of Spain, even though they all speak Mexican Spanish for some reason, and they all, and it's very small scale. I know Sadler's like, and we will take over the world, but really the point is Sadler is pathetic. It's part of his shtick. This is not me making fun of the game. This is not me saying the writing is bad. Sadler is a Bond villain, except without any of the scope or grandeur. The only reason he managed anything was because of a combination of Salazar and Mendez. So, Sadler is so pathetic and so small scale, and this is such a little, like, just a side story. This is just another day for Leon and also Ada. And yet what it did was it constantly teased the greater world around it. We get hints of what Leon's been through. We get snippets of how Umbrella has influenced things. We see some of the effects of how this is still having Ada, Wesker, etc. It teased just enough. I've talked about this before. It's the slit through the window, right? You peek through the window and you just see this. There's just this slit, and you can just kind of see what's on the other side, but not really. And it piqued my interest. Then Resident Evil 5 came out. But anyways, I'm sorry, I shouldn't do that. I haven't even beat Resident Evil 5. I actually hope to do that someday. Hint, hint. But it piqued my interest enough, and I think it did a good enough job of what it was trying to do. Which is good, because I don't think it succeeded at the other thing it was trying to do. Real quick. If you're to say, story of Resident Evil 4, what's the first thing that pops in your mind? Please share in the comments if you feel the urge or desire to do so. I'll give you a moment. She's just so adorable. Oh my god. Her name's Cat. My niece decided to, it would be amusing to name the shark Cat. I don't know humor. So, schlock, right? Or cheese, or silliness, right? That's what I hear a lot of people say when they think of Resident Evil 4's story. Most notably its tone and atmosphere. Call me a weirdo, but I no longer think that. If you rewound time about 2 days before I replayed this game, I'd say, oh yeah, no, it's cheesy and ridiculous and I love it. And now it's more like, that wasn't nearly as cheesy and ridiculous as I remember, and I think it's worse for it. Hear me out for a second. So obviously, I'm not saying that it should have to be cheesy. It doesn't have to be Metal Gear Solid 3, right? It doesn't have to be the Bond schlick. It doesn't have to be... the knife fight between Krauser and Leon, which is actually probably the best scene in the game, is the best scene because it actually legitimately embraced that ridiculousness. And it was better for it. Most of the game doesn't. It dips his toes into it and then pulls back. I think this is probably the biggest consequence of all of that, nearly 10-year development cycle and 50 bajillion versions of the game problem I mentioned earlier. Because I feel like they legitimately smashed multiple versions of the game together. Because sometimes the game is really dark and really serious, wonderfully atmospheric. And there's just this underlying tone of filthy. Like it's just gross and your skin kind of itches and you're just trying to clean yourself off and you're trying to go through this whole thing and you don't understand what's happening. And there's this menace in the distance that's kind of approaching. And it pulls off this atmosphere quite well. Most of the early chapters there's 5 chapters. Most of the early parts of the game in chapter 1 hit this point quite well. And then it shifts tone into, I don't think it knows what it's trying to be. Sometimes Salazar is... awesome. And sometimes Salazar is not. And it just kind of bounces around a little bit. There's a scene where Sadler kills Luis. Spoilers. By the way, Leon, it's pronounced Luis. And then grabs the thing and says, I will now let my minion kill you, even though you're about 5 feet from me and generally helpless. Bye. Like total Bond villain thing. And that would work if it was going for that, but then it doesn't, because then it tries to be serious. There is such a thing as mixing serious and silly. What I usually refer to that as is the Yakuza effect, because the Yakuza games do that very well. But the way they usually do that is they usually have a dividing wall in between the serious and the silly. In fact, it's usually pretty obvious. Most of the side stuff is ridiculous, most of the main stuff is very serious, and you kind of can delineate it for the most part along those lines. In a game like this, it doesn't quite work the same way because they don't really have that going for it. So,
I feel like they should have either embraced the horror or embraced the schlock. And they didn't. They didn't do either of that, and I feel like it... don't mistake me, I didn't give any negatives for the game for this, but I do feel like this game would have had a much better story if they'd actually taken one of those ideas and just absolutely ran with it. To use a very, very obvious and overt example of what I'm talking about, Devil May Cry 5. Or 3, if you want an older example. Both games took the schlock and ran with it, and were better for it. It's worth noting both games do also have serious elements to them, but... you get my point. Now, you're probably expecting me to go ahead and talk about the lore and the narrative, and there's not really a lot to talk about, if I might be so bold. The plot of this game is almost nonsensical and irrelevant. Sadler is a Krennic in the highest definition of the words, and a Bond villain, as we already mentioned. The connection to the overall mythos is almost non-existent, since all that really happens is Wesker gets his hands on some Plaga samples. I know that some of the villagers escape, which cause some issues in the future. You know, there's not much to discuss here. The Plagas are pretty gross. I mean, I wouldn't want a scorpion thing in my chest cavity. Would you? No shame, I'm just wondering. Leon, it bounces back and forth between being, you know, a cheesy one-liner and a cringy one-liner. I wish he would get over it with Ada. That is not a good relationship the two have going on. He barely knows her is really the problem there. He's lusting after an image or a concept in his mind, not the actual woman. Did they ever get together? Keep in mind, I haven't finished 5 and I haven't played past that, so I'm actually unaware on that. But anyways, that's actually all I've got. My throat is absolutely killing me. I'm actually going to go and gargle some salt water. I do hope you've enjoyed my best attempt here. I'll see you next time.